Our group is presenting on Native Americans and the consequenting results of white settlers and pioneers moving west and taking over the land that Native Americans previously inhabited and created a lifestyle upon. Eventually, the native population diminished significantly to concentrated Indian reservations in which they were forced to live. Eventually, though, as the government tried many times to wipe out the Native American population, they still survived through it all, and slowly people started to realize how horribly they had treated them. Pre-mid-1800s, the Native Americans inhabited the Missouri Midwest, and the tribes were scattered all about the plains. By the mid-1800s, pioneers started moving west in search of rich soil and better lives. But the problem was that the Indians stood right in the path of advancing whites, and this caused a clash of cultures on the plains. There was a significant difference between the industrializing nation of the pioneers and the environmentally centered lifestyles of the Indians. Because of this difference in the lifestyles of these two dramatically different groups of people, and because of the movement of the settlers and pioneers westward, the Indians felt that their land and their home was being invaded, and felt resentment toward the pioneers. However, Native Americans were used to territorial tension and conflict, as it had been happening between Indian tribes for many years. Even before the pioneers arrived, migration and dramatic cultural change were not unseen in the West. There were a lot of tribes attacking and driving other tribes off of a portion of land or onto the plains. Huge herds of buffalo attracted some of the tribes, such as the Cheyenne and the Sioux, who adapted to the Spanish ways of life, things like horses as a new method of transportation instead of walking on foot, because on horseback they could become more efficient buffalo hunters. The Plains Indians relied heavily on buffalo and used almost all of the animals. They had used the flesh of the animal for food and nutrition, the bones for tools, and the droppings for fuel for their fires. They made use of every part of the buffalo as they could so as to get as much from it as with little waste as possible. When the white settlers and pioneers came into the plains, they began to harshly treat the Indians and place them in the reservation system. The reservation system were established boundaries for each tribe's territory, basically forcing the Indians to be confined to specific areas. To this the Indians responded negatively because they felt that it was unfair that they had been taken away from the land that they had settled on at first. In the 1860s, the federal government intensified the treatment of the Indians and enforced the reservation policy by placing the natives on an even smaller reservation commonly called the Great Sioux Reservation, and this was located in the Dakota and Indian Territory. To get an idea of where this is located, it is now modern-day Oklahoma. Dozens of Plain Indians were forced onto this reservation. Although the Indians were hesitant in giving up their ancestral lands to the government, they did surrender the land only when they received a solemn promise from the federal government that while on reservations, they would be left alone and given necessary supplies.
The Indian Wars in the West were brutal. Whites sometimes ended up shooting peaceful Indians on sight to keep control and make sure there was no trouble. One big massacre was at Sand Creek, Colorado in 1864 when Colonel J. M. Chivington's militia massacred 400 Indians who thought they had been given immunity. In 1866, an Indian retaliation occurred as the Sioux Indian War Party attempted to block construction of the Bosman Trail and ambushed Captain William J. Fetterman's command of 81 soldiers and civilians in Wyoming's Bighorn Mountains. Captain Fetterman's plans can be seen on the right here. The Fetterman Massacre led to one of the few Indian triumphs in the Plain Wars because in another treaty of Fort Laramie signed in 1868, the government eventually abandoned the Bosman Trail. But in 1874, a new round of warfare with the Plains Indians began when Custer led what he believed was a scientific expedition into the Black Hills of South Dakota, part of the Sioux Reservation, and announced that he had discovered gold. As such, hordes of greedy gold seekers swarmed into the Sioux lands. The Sioux fought back and attacked Colonel Custer's 7th Cavalry, a superior force of some 2,500 well-armed warriors, nearly half of them immigrants. Cavalry and his 264 officers and men were completely wiped out in 1876 when two supporting columns failed to come to their rescue. In the other months, more battles ensued as the U.S. Army continuously hunted down the Indians who had humiliated Custer. In these battles, while the Indians had some short-lived victories, the ending results of each were always the same: an immense decrease in native population and dehumanization and destruction of native cultures. This relentless fire and sword policy of the whites at last shattered the spirit of the Indians. The vanquished population of Native Americans was finally ghettoized on reservations where they could theoretically preserve their cultural autonomy, but were in fact compelled to live as wards of the government. The federal government eventually combined misconceived treaty programs with intermittent warfare when they forced the Indians onto largely barren reservations. Their white masters had at last discovered that the Indians were much cheaper to feed than to fight. Even so, for many decades, they were almost ignored to death. The taming of the Indians was engineered by a number of factors. Of cardinal importance was the railroad, which shot an iron arrow through the heart of the West. Locomotives could bring out unlimited numbers of troops: farmers, cattlemen, sheep herders, and settlers. The Indians were also ravaged by the white people's disease, to which they showed little resistance, and by their firewater, to which they showed almost no resistance. Above all, the virtual extermination of the buffalo doomed the Plains Indians' nomadic way of life. And the end of the trail is about the end of the government's involvement with the Native Americans during this century. Helen Hunt Jackson was a Massachusetts writer, the author of 2 keystone books in the recognition of the plight of Native Americans over the entire course of American history. Her first novel, A Century of Dishonor, was a summary of the American government's upsetting relationship with Native Americans. It specifically emphasized their cultural insensitivity and brutality, starting with the arrival of the British settlers. And her second novel, Ramona, focuses on Californian Native groups. It is also a love story, which made it much more popular with middle-class women of the time. It was a huge success and made many people more sympathetic to Native Americans. Her picture is on the lower left. The disregard of American culture. There are 3 sides to the argument during this time on what to do with the natives. You can Christianize them, continue treating them harshly, or assimilate them into white society. All options looked over the natives' strong cultural backgrounds and ways of life. Many people were totally insensitive. If Native people refused to participate in this white culture, those in charge of reservations would withhold food and other resources until they did. The Battle of Wounded Knee was the last large Native American uprising. It was a clash between the Sioux and American Army in 1884. After the government outlawed the sacred sun dance, a large part of Native American religious ceremonies, a culture sprang up in the Sioux community in order to hang on to their cultural heritage. The government shut it down with bloody swiftness, killing over 200 men, women, and children of the Sioux tribe. They had done nothing violent to try and keep this dance alive other than keep it. The Dawes Severalty Act of 1887 dissolved tribes as legal entities and therefore removed their ownership from the land. Tribes had always seen their link to the land as their heritage and way of life, and the government still took it away. The land not used for reservations was sold to railroads and to settlers for government profit. Under this act, natives were granted citizenship after 25 years of being good white settlers. This would mean that they wouldn't cause any violence and would adopt the white way of life. Kill the Indian, save the man was a popular phrase in this century. Native children were often taken from their parents in tribal homes and sent to schools far away, like indoctrination schools in Pennsylvania. These schools taught them white customs and values and forced them to give up their tribal heritage and languages. Field matrons were white women sent to reservations to teach other Native women white values of chastity and hygiene, because whites did not believe that Indians naturally had these values. In an attempt to cancel out the forced assimilation of the last century, the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 finally gave Native Americans full citizenship and reorganized tribes as an attempt to cancel all of their horrible actions from before. In the left corner, you can see the Battle of Wounded Knee. The
very top picture is several Native children who've been removed from their tribal lands and sent to schools. And the Dawes Severalty Act can be seen on the right at the top saying Indian land for sale.